Buenos dias, bienvenidos. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Our apologies for starting a little bit late. We had a bit of technical difficulties, but we are on our way to providing you with an hour filled of really important and exciting dialogue. My name is Denise Hurst, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of Advancement and External Affairs here at Springfield Technical Community College. And it is my pleasure to be able to provide introductions this afternoon for our event, Latinos Unidos. So before I begin, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge those who helped to make today's presentation a success. So on behalf of our president, I want to thank our Office of Community Engagement, which is led by our amazing director, Lydia Rivera Early, our Office of Multicultural Affairs that is also led by another extraordinarily amazing woman, Ms. Veneta Smith, as well as the HAHE, is known as the Hispanic Association of Higher Education, which is co-chaired by Ms. Jennifer Wallace and Yesenia Figueroa Lopez. So thank you all who put this together. We are really excited. So we're going to move quickly into our program because it's going to be a great dialogue. But before we do that, we want to be able to allow you an opportunity to hear greetings from our president, Dr. John B. Cook.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Good afternoon, everyone. Also, warm welcome and greetings to our campus community and to our community at large. It's a wonderful month. It is Hispanic Heritage Month. We are blessed to be federally designated as a Hispanic serving institution. What a wonderful opportunity as an institution of higher education to have forums like this where we can listen, where we can learn, where we can come together. I'm very much appreciative of the title of the forum, and I also want to express thanks to our facilitator and our panelists, to Heshima, to Karolyn, our former esteemed student trustee, Manuel, Rene, Ahmad. Thank you so much for your time and for your perspective. I will quickly get out of the way, but again, what a wonderful opportunity for us collectively as an institution to again listen and learn. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, President Cook. So I'll jump right in with providing bios for our esteemed panelists, but I do want to ensure that the listening audience and the community at large knows that this is the first event to kick off the Hispanic Heritage Month, and we do have another. And please stay tuned to hear more about that event, and also feel free to visit our website at stcc.edu. Our very first panelist, Karolyn Borges Turibio, is a recent graduate of STCC, class of 2019. While Karolyn was at STCC, she served honorably on our trustee board and was the chairwoman of the Black and Hispanic Women's Association. Karolyn is now a student at Elms College, working towards a bachelor's degree in business management. She aspires to continue her education and obtain a graduate degree and pursue a career in higher education. Karolyn is de la República Dominicana, Dominican Republic. Thank you, Karolyn, for being here with us today. Rene Gonzalez, an amazing multi-instrumentalist musician, author of books on the subject of Ifa practice, a Yoruban Caribbean religion. He holds a bachelor's degree in legal studies and a master's degree in political science from the University of Massachusetts. Rene also is a committed caseworker for the elderly population here in the greater Springfield area. Thank you, Rene.
Thank you.
Dr. Manuel Frau-Ramos. If you don't know Dr. Manuel Frau-Ramos, then you are missing out. Manuel holds a bachelor's and master's degree in economics from the University of Puerto Rico and a doctoral degree in education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Manuel has had an impressive career in higher education dating back to the early 80s. He has served as an assistant professor in the schools of public administration and education. Manuel has a strong commitment to the Puerto Rican and Latino community here in Western Mass. He serves as the editor of El Sol Latino, a monthly bilingual publication, and founded the Puerto Rico Culture Project, an initiative that promotes services and resources focused on the Puerto Rican Latino community, as well as providing music concerts and a speaker series. Gracias, Manuel. A dear friend of mine, Ahmad Rivera Wagner. Ahmad is a native of Springfield, Mass, but currently lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and most recently has been appointed to serve as the city's community liaison. Ahmad has an extensive and rich understanding and passion for public policy. His professional experience includes serving as the state policy director for United States Senator Ed.D, as well as the director of housing policy at Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. Ahmad honorably served the city of Springfield as the first openly gay city councilor. During his time on the council, he championed an anti-foreclosure ordinance to protect homeowners from predatory banks, stopped a biomass plant that would have posed a long-term public health problem, and expanded access to city services for non-English speakers. Ahmad holds a degree in marketing from Bentley University and a master's in education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And last but certainly not least, Hashima Moja. He is a composer, musician, scholar in arts and cultural consultant who walks in a world where music, art, and scholarship intersect. Throughout his impressive career, Heshima has composed music for Nickelodeon, PBS, and various films throughout Latin America, and has released 2 of his own CDs. He has recorded and shared the stage with some of the greatest names in the music industry, which represent a broad cross-section of cultural expression, including R&B legends Patti LaBelle, High Five, Mary J. Blige, Latin music superstars La India, Grammy-winning Latin jazz trombonist and composer William Cepeda, to name a few. Heshima is no stranger to the community of Springfield. His contributions of music and art are greatly appreciated. He will serve as our moderator for today's panel. Without further ado, I turn it over to your leadership, Heshima.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. Thank you, Lydia, for the invitation to facilitate this really important discussion. We are living in a time of great change, and it's certainly an honor and a privilege to participate in those movements for change, and it's an honor to be here to speak with such amazing panelists today. So just a quick guideline about our discussion, because we have so much ground to cover, and all of you are more than capable of answering at great length all of these questions. We want to kind of allow for each voice to be heard equally, and also to allow some time at the end for questions from the people who are logged on, who are attending this discussion. So what we'd like to ask is if we could be respectful of time by kind of setting a 2-minute limit on ourselves as we answer questions, which will also allow for rebuttals or for other panelists to respond to each of your replies to the questions that we have. So, and nobody will be sitting with a cane, so nobody will be pulling anybody off the screen if you somehow don't abide by the 2 minutes, but we'd like to just do that in service of the discussion that we have today. So today we're here to talk about the term Latinx and how it applies to our communities, what each of us thinks or what each of you think about this term. So the question that I'd like to begin with is a very simple one, and that is, when did you first become aware of the term Latinx? What were your initial thoughts about this term being used to describe the sometimes Latino, sometimes Hispanic communities, right? And then also, Have you been having discussions? Do you discuss this term within your circles, friends, family, and how might you and your friends and family identify with this term? So who'd like to answer?
Can I begin?
Manuel, yes.
Okay, thank you,
Yep.
Profe. Okay, for me it's very easy. I have been aware of that term for a long time because I belong to the Puerto Rican Study Association. I'm on some of the members of Puerto Rico Study Association. That debate began probably 2 years ago. Also, I'm on the Dominican Studies Association member. They have the same issue, especially from New Jersey. From my point of view of a journalist, it makes my job easy because in terms of doing Latino, Hispanic, I adopted Latinx and they cover everything. And I have no problem with that. I begin to use locally with some of the conversation with Nelson Roman in Holyoke that he usually use that term. I have a conversation with him and I decided, okay, let's go with this way. And I adopted. I have no problem with that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah.
Anybody else who would like to answer or to respond? Karolyn, please.
All right, so I first heard the term when I was at an ASI conference, which is for Hispanic Serving Institutions, which was thanks to my time at stake. I went with some of my mentors. And in some of my sessions, you know, we were in Chicago, so some of these people, the students and the educators, when they were talking, they were using this word, and I'm like, what does that even mean? What is this? So that's when I kind of first heard of that. That was about 2 years ago. And in terms of having conversations with any of my peers, honestly, I haven't really had any conversations about the word like too in depth, but yeah, that's when I first heard of it.
Okay, thank you. Rene.
Well, the same deal. I think I've heard it in the last 2 or 5 years. I think where I heard it from was mostly academia, mostly progressive left groups, activist groups in particular, LGBT activist groups, feminist activist groups. In terms of how I took it, I wasn't in favor of the use of the term. I probably have the same views that a lot of other people have about the issue of the language, not necessarily needing that change. But in terms of what other people think about it, at least here in the United States, with my family, with friends, most people agree with me. It's a non-issue for them, and if pressed on the issue, they almost see it kind of like an imposition. In Puerto Rico, I've never heard it. In Cuba, when I've traveled to Cuba, I've never heard it. It's not even a non-issue there. I've had conversations maybe with some Venezuelans and Colombians. They basically say, literally, I hate to say it this way, eso cosa de gringo. So they just simply dismiss it. They're very dismissive about it in South America. That's the only thing I've seen so far, kind of like just, what's the word, looking at the subject very superficially.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And Ahmad.
Similar to Rene and Karolyn, it's I heard it very recently, and I work in politics, so I've heard it many ways around political academic conversations and then activist conversations, and ironically, somewhat of a trickling up to white spaces, particularly political spaces that were won by white folks and then often engaged by younger folks who are involved in them. Those are often coming from academic backgrounds in certain particular places. As far as the conversation goes, from Massachusetts to Green Bay, Wisconsin, where they have a large Chicano population, most people have never heard of this term. And often leading with Latinx, it doesn't mean anything. I do know that there was some strong dynamics connected to the queer LGBT community in which folks were kind of grappling with multicultural, multilingual issues around gender. But ultimately, as far as a self-identifier, I don't actually see most Latinos or Hispanics or Latinidad or whatever we use, using Latinx at all. And so it often is a very strange disconnect because I don't know that many people that identify that way outside of politicized identity, particularly around left-leaning politics.
Thank you. Those are interesting. Those are interesting viewpoints. And I think that just as a point of information for those who are tuning in to the panel, as far as I have been able to surmise, right, through a little bit of research, the term first formally appeared in a periodical, in a professional journal, psychological journal. A psychologist in Puerto Rico was writing a paper in 2009 and was looking for inclusive language to allow for the inclusion of non-binary identifying folks. And so 2009 seems to be the first time where this term appears formally in an academic or a professional journal in terms of being published. Now, the question I'd like to follow with is this one. You know, we're discussing the use of the adoption or the rejection of a term in terms of 13 countries throughout the world, as well as the United States, which is often referred to as the diaspora, right? I guess that the question I want to ask is, who gets to determine the use of language as it pertains to the naming of a people? We've dealt with many terms, and we'll delve a little deeper into this through the lens of sociolinguistics later on, hopefully. But for those who are inclined to want to talk about that subject, but we've been named Latino, Hispanic, and really that discussion took place really centering around the idea of the US Census. And so that was really about how the US government was looking to define an entire population here within the United States for the purposes of the census, right? But who is it? And this is obviously open to anybody. Who is it that really gets to determine this language, which is really tied to our narrative and our identity here in the United States? Who should have the right, or what is the process that should take place if we're looking at adopting or rejecting a term which identifies or seeks to identify an entire population, not just one national group of Spanish speakers?
Nobody wants to be the first one to get
I want to make sure that the question was clear, but then I said, well, maybe that's a hot potato question.
I am still thinking about it. Okay.
I see Ahmad raising his hand, and then Manuel.
Well, yeah. What I will first say is I do think there needs to be a disaggregation from any of the ultimate terms that we use for collective being for people who may share a language, but may not even share a geographic origin, culture, and other things. So for example, I think in politics and in policy, there's been such a move to somehow lump Latinos, Latinx, Hispanics, Latina, like whatever that group is, they just keep adding or just subtracting, and some people don't either. But the truth is that there is a difference between the experiences of Venezuelans versus Puerto Ricans, or Cubanos versus Central Americans, or Chicanos versus also Puerto Ricans. The pathways or relationships with the US government, the public policies that impact them. And while the only thing that actually attaches them together in many ways is the relationship the US and white supremacy has to the creation of public policy, that ultimately it is somewhat of a disservice to the broad, beautiful breadth of our community that is also connected, that is also multiracial, like there are Afro-Latinos even within the diaspora. And how do we ensure that we do that? So I guess my point is that I think first and foremost, we need to disaggregate the idea that somehow there has to be a lumping in of people who may or may not share the same language, but is perceived by those in power and those who operationalize government as having to be lumped together. I think we need to be encouraging institutions, government, public policy to reflect that the Dominicans in Lowell are different than the Cubans in Florida, the Chicanos in Wisconsin are different than the Puerto Ricans in Holyoke, and they have to actually navigate the public policy and cultural dynamics to help ensure that we're addressing the issues of structural racism, not only within those communities, but the way those communities are experiencing their lived experiences. So I just want to advocate for the idea. I don't think we should be in the game of naming whole populations of people that have all kinds of different relationships to each other and the government, and that we should be working on solving their problems based on their cultural identity and their language that they use.
Yeah.
Thank you. Someone
Rene?
Oh, Rene, okay.
But you know what? The issue of credibility it goes to the crux of the matter, because if there is no credibility from the groups that are mostly proposing this particular, and that's what we're going to determine, obviously, in this discussion. But if there's no credibility from the groups that are proposing this term, then it colors the consequences of the use of the terminology. Whether or not the language itself is a natural democratic expression of the peoples that have this language. First and foremost, as a cultural product of the Castilian people of Spain, because this is theirs first and foremost. But then as an adoption, as a very native and born and bred adoption of the Latin American nations. So those are the people that first it has to come from. And if it's not coming from those people, then it goes to the issue of credibility. So one of the questions, I took a few notes, one of the questions I put for myself is, what credibility do US-based descendants of Latinos have to create and to impose upon the rest of Latin America the use of a modified, dare I say, United States colonized language or dialect of Spanish? What credibility do United States of Latin American descent have to impose on the actual born and bred residents of the homeland countries that they must change their languages to accommodate the social political movement aspirations of extreme minority activist lobbies, aspirations that may be completely contrary to the desires or realities of the cultures and ethnic groups in the homeland country, like Ahmad was saying. So we are again assuming that the way that US-based activist groups or Latinos have decided to approach transgenderism, as an example, is the way Latin American groups in the home countries want to approach it. That's one thing. And then the issue also is an issue of consent, which goes to the second part, the issue of the democratic expression of the people. And the question is, have the people of Latin America been consulted on the development of the term and its application? Have they consented? How is imposing a term on people from the cultural throes of an extreme minority in the metropolis in the USA any different than cultural colonialism? By saying that we in the developed USA know better than those in Latin America and are teaching Latin Americans to shed their supposedly machista ways and language, we're taking a purposeful position that we are advanced and they are backwards, and that they must be taught. And isn't this the same thought process that informed early European settlers in the Americas and that led to the horrors of conquest and colonialism? So personally speaking, I find that the development of the Latinx language, or the gender neutral language, is a product first of an extreme minority of progressive left activist lobbies in the academia of the USA, and of its associated and similar thinking cultural circles in Latin American nations. And B, it's proposed by the same people who are perfectly willing to impose this on others without considering their views on the matter. The theory being, if we normalize it through continued repetition, overall, you do that overall objections. And it strikes me as the same type of thinking that informed evangelizing colonizers. Repeat the education of the Bible, repeat the education of European language, and destroy all vestiges of formerly existing religious, cultural, and linguistic practice. So it's one of the reasons why the application of the term in the United States, it's a little bit offensive to me in that situation, because again, it goes to the issue of, does this term have any credibility in terms that it comes organically from the groups that develop the language, or is it coming from a particular, very extreme, small diaspora group of US-based descendant Latinos? That's a question that we have to always have, ¿cómo se dice? When we're having this discussion. Tíralo, Manuel, te veo.
Okay, please, Manuel.
Mr. Puedo. Okay, in fact, following the thought of Rene, I got somebody sent me a article published 2 days ago in Sora.medium.com. The title is "The Latinx Labor Centers European heritage. We should stop using it. And basically by Adriana Maestas. Basically, she was complaining that the Latinx movement is imposing a label to a group that in the past, basically she's talking about the Mexican experience, imposed Hispanic to native from Mexico, then imposed Latino for that group. And now we are imposing Latinx. And the point of her is, even we don't speak Spanish. Why you are imposing this label to a group that even some of them have problem with the Mexican identity?
That's an interesting point. And I was jotting some notes down. So just as a follow-up to the comments that both Rene and Frau and Ahmad were making. So let's make an assumption that at some point there is some type of desire expressed on the mass level, on the level of the masses, right, throughout Latin America. And Rene, you brought up the idea of democratization, right, using the democratic process to give credibility to. So let's assume for a second that there was some mass movement for the use or the adoption of this term. What is a way that you can envision the democratic process being used in order to give credibility to the adoption of a term like Latinx? What would a scenario look like in order to make that happen?
Possibly referenda at the national level. Most of the countries that I know of, and I've studied their politics, have had on different types of cultural issues. For example, like in Bolivia, as an example, as a multinational state, they call themselves a plurinational state. So they've had the adoption of certain constitutional changes to accommodate the reality of the indigenous people of Bolivia, which wasn't done before with the mostly Euro-descendant Bolivian population elites. They had never included that into their constitutions, but there was referenda on all types of issues. So the issue of culture, the issue of religions, the issue of cultural practices being recognized as legitimate and being able to be practiced freely in a nation, even those concepts could be as important as the decision regarding what's the sovereignty status of a nation. And in the case of Puerto Rico, which there's a discussion in the Congress right now of possibly have a constituent assembly to resolve the matter. So if that is important for people to express themselves regarding where the nation or a particular country is going, I think it's equally important to ask the people, are you okay with the modification of your language? And to know all the details. Who is modifying this language? What is the purpose of this? Because that's another conception. On top of the issue whether or not they consent to the modification of language, because of the people that are proposing it. There might be a lot of people in Latin America who might be in disagreement just basically on that, on who's proposing this and where it's coming from. But two, for what purposes? And there hasn't been a holistic and democratizing discussion in Latin America about what is transgenderism? How do we approach it? There's people who believe that it can't be even possible. There's people who believe it's possible. It might be a mental disorder, but it needs to be treated or it needs to be analyzed, but not necessarily change our pronouns or our labels. And then, of course, the minority view in the United States, which is to say, okay, they get to self-identify how they want. And not only that, they get to impose on everybody else how everybody else has to relate to them. Because I remember there was a time when people could say, I consider myself a woman, and they were maybe a biological man. But that would be left there. They would impose themselves. Now it's much more common to have people say, I'm a woman, and I want you to call me by a woman. So the conversation has moved from consent and democratizing language to, if you do not call me by the terms I want, then you must be a bigot of some sort. You must be a phobe of some sort. So those type of conversations need to be had at the national level. And every nation should be able to decide. Maybe the Dominican Republic wants to use the language, but maybe the Cubans don't. Or maybe the Venezuelans don't. So every people should be able to decide that particular matter. And it's a little bit difficult because if one, two, or three different nations start using that modified language, it can become an issue of social and cultural strife between nations. between peoples. There could be some countries that are willing to adopt it, and there are others that won't. So to the question, it should be through a plebiscite. I mean, every nation should discuss the matter. Should we modify our language? Should our education departments in all these nations officially adopt this? As far as I know, the Spanish institutions on the subject have already analyzed the situation, and they've said they're not going to modify the language. And I think most other nations in Latin America are following that flow from Spain.
Okay, thank you, Rene. Karolyn, I wanted to kind of call on you as well and have you chime in. For you, what is the feeling? How are you identifying? I mean, in your daily life, are you bought into the idea of Latinx, or for you is this some sort of imposition, as what Rene might have been mentioning, or what Manuel actually mentioned? How are you feeling about this term?
I mean, I honestly don't really use it as much. I accept it. I love it. I don't have anything against it. I think I don't really find myself in the opportunity. Actually, no, that's a lie. I find myself in the opportunities to probably say it, but I think we're so used to saying like, oh, I'm Hispanic, I don't really say, oh, I'm Latinx. I think this term, I could be wrong, I could be right, but I think it really helps in terms of like, how America is really evolving in terms of how we see gender and how people identify. So for people in like the pan communities, like that might be something that's really helpful to them because they don't have to choose a gender. They could say they're Latinx, not Latino, Latina. But I think I just haven't really found myself in a position to like, and I don't feel forced to say Latinx. I wish I could say it more. I think I just kind of forget it myself, but that's how I view it.
Thank you. So I do want to mention, just before I call on Ahmad, I just want to mention, because I would be remiss, for those who are attending the panel, if you have questions within the platform, there should be in the chat platform or the Q&A section, I believe, yes, there's a Q&A section. You can include your questions, and we will be setting time aside for questions at the end, but I understand that as we speak, you see me here even with my notebook writing down things in order to facilitate the discussion. It's very easy to forget as well our questions. So please include the questions, and then at the end, we will be allotting some time for questions and some space for people to respond to those questions. Ahmad, please.
Well, one, I do want to separate the conversation between the idea of trans people coming up with identification and the navigating of that system within the United States who happen to be of color or who do not, English is not their first language. I think that is for me, that is a very separate issue, even though it's somewhat attached to this conversation. Trans people being able to identify how they identify should not be, to me, the same dynamic as lumping a large group of people into a term that not only doesn't come from that particular community, but is the nomenclature of like academic access and political perspective. And so I just want to like be very clear, those things are very separated. That like trans people should be able to identify how they identify and navigate the public policy systems in which they're in, versus people labeling a whole community something different that doesn't even necessarily exist in a language. And what I want to emphasize on that in particular is that what's interesting about Latinx as a term is that we actually don't impose this kind of gender binary on any other language, even English, so Russian, French, Italian. There is no other place, even in political spaces or government, in which we ascribe that the language is so gendered that it is required to be uprooted and recreated in a language that doesn't even exist with them. As you all know, the relationship of X in Spanish is like not the way that they're using it. And so one of the things I would want to hope that we really start thinking about and focusing on is if we do want to have more gender inclusive language, we should start looking at Spanish as a language and what are the tools already in the toolbox around gender expression. There are lots of communities, including indigenous Taino communities, that have all kinds of names, Spanish language names for gender that weren't just based on a binary system. But Latinx, we only do that for Spanish-speaking folks. So for me, that feels like it is a tool of whiteness, that this is the way that which we clump a bunch of people together, and then we force a gender understanding on a language in which it doesn't exist, and ultimately lump all kinds of people together to necessarily, in my mind, cloud the kind of need-based things that folks need from government and from policy by saying, well, we're going to call it Latinx, and that somehow makes us progressive, and we can describe the public policy that works for everybody because we're doing Latinx policy. That doesn't even make sense from a structural framework. So I really want, for me, I think it is pushing back on the idea that somehow people who speak Spanish or come from descendants that speak Spanish somehow have to have this term describe them when we need our needs met by government, and that there is language for that to exist. And when it doesn't exist, we should be looking into that language and cultural spaces for where it has existed before we reinvent words that don't even exist in the native tongue.
Interesting. Frau, would you like, Manuel, would you like to chime in? Because I know you've been waiting patiently, but I can also see you moving in your seat.
No, it's okay.
Oh, okay. All right. So then I want to also respond to something, or come with a follow-up question to something, Ahmad, that you just talked about. And that's really around the issue of language, right? Because you mentioned that there is language in place that can help communities who need services and who need representation. It's already there. And you mentioned the idea of academic access, and I would just kind of lump in the idea of access in general, right? To information. Can you talk for a moment about some of that language that's already in place that people may not be aware of when it comes to gaining access to services, gaining access to representation, and to having one's voice heard, right? Because we're really talking about narrative, which we'll talk about in a second. Could you expound just a little bit on that?
So particularly around trans issues, I'll start there, then we can talk about other forms of access. They're already navigating in a public health context, allowing people to identify with the gender that they feel expresses their true self. And so in many ways, the term Latinx actually isn't the appropriate language, right? So if we're talking about trans issues and pansexuality and LGBT and queer issues in general, there is actually a language that exists around that. And ironically, there is languages both in Spanish and others that do describe the experiences of queer and LGBT folks as well. We don't actually have to reinvent a term. But overall, around advocacy, the truth of the matter is that we've often been defined by white services, meaning, you said this earlier on, the reason where Hispanic came from was actually an outcome of a miscount of what we are now calling Latinos, Latinidad, just Spanish-speaking populations that were being forced to either be Black or white, and they were both choosing both sides and then not choosing any at all. And so the government created this term to help get a better sense of census, which actually was about congressional representation, fiscal monies for university land grants, access to farming subsidies, small business things. So the truth is that we've always been somewhat, as a community, entrapped in the idea that we are trying to be labeled so that we can get the both reflection and services and needs from government. Ironically, there hasn't been much. There's been some local folks trying to contest this, but in general, these words are evolving outside of people who speak Spanish or people who are descendants of Spanish speakers living in this country now, because what's happening in Mexican communities is not what's happening in Texas, is not what's happening to Puerto Rican communities necessarily in Holyoke. And so what I think we need to start doing is being more clear about things that we need, right? If it's about being counted around census, what is the language that's going to get access for people to be counted, or even understanding that the census is important? What does voting look like? Just because you are Latinx, you might actually be documented or undocumented. What does that mean for public policy across the spectrum of terms that we're allowing people to label us on, when there is a difference between a Cuban and a Dominican? And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think there is language that already exists about culture, language, and where you've come from and where you've been, and then to force our government and our institutions to be reflective of that, versus forcing us to do a catch-all term to make it easier for dominant groups to somehow do the work for us when they're doing it in an incomplete way as we speak.
Thank you. Yeah, that's important information. I'm wondering, you know, I wanted to talk about this or just quote another piece of information, and then we do have some comments and a question that I would like to just present from a person who's attending. There was a study which was released by the Pew Research Center just in August, actually, August 11th, around this term Latinx. So I'd like to just quote, if I could, some of this, just a couple paragraphs of this study. So it says, more recently, a new gender-neutral pan-ethnic label, Latinx, has emerged as an alternative that is used by some news and entertainment outlets, corporations, local governments, and universities to describe the nation's Hispanic population. However, for the population it is meant to describe, only 23% of US adults who self-identify as Hispanic or Latino have heard of the term Latinx. And just 3% say they use it to describe themselves, according to a nationally representative bilingual survey of US Hispanic adults conducted in December by the Pew Research Center. The emergence of Latinx coincides with a global movement to introduce gender-neutral norms and pronouns into many languages whose grammar has traditionally used male and female constructions. In the United States, the first uses of Latinx appeared more than a decade ago, and it was added to a widely used English dictionary in 2018, reflecting its greater use. So getting back to the idea of language, right? And as we think about this term, or we reflect on this term, you know, through the lens of sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, and the idea of the evolution of language, which is a constant, right? I'm thinking back to the late 80s and the early 90s when there was a huge debate, particularly in the Los Angeles Unified School District, about the inclusion of Ebonics into urban education. And that was particularly relating to the African-American community or the Black community, right? And when we think about the evolution of language to describe many groups, we think about the N-word to Negro, to Afro-American, which a friend of mine said, well, I'm not a hairstyle, so I don't want to be called Afro-American. And then it was African-American. And now, as we discuss the idea of reparations in America for the descendants of Africa who were enslaved here in the United States, there's a discussion around Black identification as a Black American versus being a member of a Black Caribbean or West Indian identification, or being an African immigrant, and how reparations may apply based upon how one identifies. We mentioned earlier the idea of Latino and Hispanic, and now Latinx. So this next question for you all is two parts. One, well, Ahmad alluded to it, but I'd like you all to expound, if you could, the fact or the idea that there are, even within the Spanish language, are there ways in which we already gender neutrally identify, right? Which speaks to this whole idea of Latinx being a way in which we address gender neutrality, right? Or address non-binary people who identify differently. And then also, do you feel that this term is a term that, excuse me, I just got so many questions here. Do you believe that the term is another way for non-Spanish speakers to impose an identity upon Spanish speakers, meaning people from outside the communities? Or do you believe that this is simply an evolution in language? Is this just another step in the evolution of language? I see Karolyn making a fist like, do I want to answer? Karolyn, why don't you go ahead and then Rene.
I don't know. I have my thoughts, but I don't want to get attacked. I don't even know how to. Okay, take it easy on me, people. No, but I just don't. I don't really see how the term is. I don't know. Maybe forced. Maybe I'm not looking into it too much. But some people are feel like they're forced, and I don't know. I feel like it's a good term. It's gender neutral. It's like you were saying, like you got Russian, Italian, Latinx. It'll cover everybody. It won't impose a gender. It's not imposing I guess an identity. But maybe I'm haven't looked into it too far. But I guess my opinion is just that I am not against the term. I don't think it's like it's being a force. Maybe it's my age. Maybe it's just my generation. I don't know what it is, but I don't know. I don't want to get attacked, but I'm gonna put it that way.
No, that's fine. Con confianza. Manuel.
Let me follow Karolyn's thought. I think one of the issues here is generation. Those who are older remember the label Dominican, New Ricans, Boricua, Puerto Rican, no, Afro-Puerto Ricans, Latino, Hispanic. Every generation have a label. And I think that probably Latinx is a generation issue more than any else.
Okay. Oh, Rene, please.
Just on your question, when you said, is this something that's coming from the outside? Funny enough, I don't see it originally as being a term where white people are using it. I think they've come to realize that since the people who are, first and foremost, I think this is a proposition of Latinos, of U.S. Latino descendants, not even Latin Americans from the home countries. I think there's cultural flows of circles, I'm talking academia, I'm talking about people with access to education in Latin America who are, have an ear. There's a term in a lot of the political science literature, even within the periphery, which is Latin America or the third world, or whichever way you want to say it, there's always a metropolis, or there's always a circle of people with access to education, power, economic power, and political power, social power, that are always looking to the cultural flows from the empires. If you were in a French colony, you were looking to France. If you were in the British colony in Africa, you were always looking to the philosophers or the musical styles or the dancing or the linguistic usage of the colonizers. What are the people in London or in Paris doing? And that's what you would use. I think Frantz Fanon talks about that in his books, in The Wretched of the Earth, and other books about colonialism. But in the situation of Latin America, the United States is obviously in the Western Hemisphere the preeminent power. It's preeminent power in the world as well, even though things are changing politically speaking. But in terms of Latin America, the groups that are in Latin America look to other Latino groups of access in the universities, the people who write articles, write influential, discussions on the issues of the day all over the world. And I think the term started first and foremost here in academia or in activist groups. To the issue that Ahmad was saying, that we should separate this from transgenderism, yes and no in my perspective, and not because I want to include them. It's because generally speaking, if you were a biological male or you were a biological female, or you're heterosexual male or even homosexual female or male, whether your sexual orientation is that you prefer women as a woman, a lesbian woman, or as a homosexual man, you still consider yourself los. Yo soy Rene, or I am Rene, or soy parte de los hombres. I am a part of the men. If it was a woman, yo soy parte de las mujeres. So the use of the language already for us, no matter our sexual orientation, would be fine. It was with the presence of people who don't identify on the binary definition, that the issue becomes problematic. And then that's where certain academic circles, progressive people, activist groups here in the United States have tried to think, okay, well, what can we do to include a term that applies to people who are saying, I'm not a biological male, or I feel a female even though I'm a biological male. I would posit that we already have the language in Spanish for it. We could just use ustedes, las personas, which is very, neutral in that sense. But even if I was labeling a person, funny enough, it fits with both groups. If you're self-identifying as a transgendered female, you can say, yo soy la mujer, even though you may not be biologically. Yo me estoy diciendo la mujer. The language already gives you the tool to be able to self-identify as a woman, la mujer, or whichever other feminine terminology. And if you're a man looking at this person who disagrees that this person is transgender and wants to reply, says, no, tú eres un hombre, los hombres, both the person opposing the person's self-identification and the person self-identifying have language available to them through Spanish to be able to make their arguments. There's no need for the Latinx situation. And to the point that you mentioned about the 3%, when 3% of the people are adopting it, it's very clear that it has no democratic upswell. It's not coming from us. I don't think that the educated Anglo-American communities here in the United States are imposing it. I think they just kind of saw the debate. A lot of the cultural circles, a lot of these Anglo-Americans that are in positions of power also have Latino friends with education as well. They heard the use of Latinx in certain conferences and they thought, oh, okay, well, I guess if you guys are using it, then we'll use this to try to be respectful of you guys. I think, unfortunately, from the distance that they have culturally from our communities, they're not realizing that, no, 97% of the population in the US of Latino descent, and I would be willing to bet 99.9% of the people in the Latin American countries are not self-identifying in this way. So it's not an expression from us. It's an expression of a very particular minority within the educated classes of Latino descendants in the USA. And that goes to the issue from the beginning, I said it, from credibility. How much credibility do US-based United Stations, we have to make that difference, United Stations of Latino descent versus Latinos or Latin Americans from the homeland countries? It gets to a really large debate about an issue of credibility, because I'm sure Latin Americans in Caracas, en Bogotá, en La Habana, en Puerto Rico, espérate, los latinoamericanos somos nosotros. And that is a really strong debate, even within our home countries, regarding the credibility of a person who was born in the USA, said, no, yo soy puertorriqueño, what are you talking about? You lived in New York your whole life. You haven't even heard of coquí. And these are the type of debates, colloquially speaking, that people have about issues of identity. So if we have those cultural identity issues just on the issue of whether or not you're even a Latino, a Latin American, imagine if the people who don't have the credibility to even say they're Latino are the ones creating the terminology. That's just putting the icing on the cake for a lot of Latin Americans on the issue of credibility.
Thank you. Ahmad, do you like to,
I think Rene is completely correct in that I think Spanish in itself does actually have room for us to describe our experiences across the sexuality and gender identity spectrum. And that's why, and ironically, I do hear this more in white spaces than I hear them in Spanish-speaking places, truthfully, even in my experience now politically. And then we often have to translate Latinx to like the Chicanos in Green Bay, Wisconsin, or the Spanish-speaking folks in Holyoke, Massachusetts. They don't use that term, but political spaces, which I think Rene is right, are looking to this educated elite who they're trying to, virtue signal that we get you, we think we're part of you, except it doesn't actually speak to regular people. I still think what I want to like separate is that even English has struggled with trying to deal with binary dynamics around gender. And so what I find so interesting is that the emphasis on doing this in Spanish, even though Latinx is not a Spanish word. And this happened when we started dealing with trans folks who were, and there was even a whole separate language. So it went from, pronouns being she, him, she, hers, he, him. It was also they, them. They, them came up out of, they actually created something called Z. So it's supposed to be Z, they, them. And it was actually literally a Z. And they tried to do this in English. And it worked for a while, and it came from academic circles, and it completely imploded on itself because it was difficult. People couldn't really understand where it came from. It didn't make any sense linguistically. It didn't make sense grammatically. And so most people don't know this, but like we've just completely almost dropped that off, and it only exists in the far reaches of academic and activist spaces and very elite activist, because it didn't actually function with the language we have. So we more so see now they, them as non-binary identifiers and demarcations in our language. So I guess what I'm saying is that we have to be very careful that we don't let communities that couldn't even do it in their own language echo, reify, and move forward with recreating our language to do what they couldn't do in their own. And we actually don't see any other of these things existing in any other Romance language and even non-Romance languages in the entire world. And so I want to just be very cognizant that if we couldn't make it function in English, we shouldn't allow English-speaking spaces that are political trying to reach Spanish-speaking communities or communities of Spanish-speaking peoples use Latinx as a way that it actually means anything to us, because it doesn't. It only means something, most notably, to elite spaces who they're trying to virtue signal that often are academic. And so there's just a disconnect. So that I just wanted to add that, like, this didn't work in English either.
Just a quick addendum to the issue of Ahmad.
One minute, only because we have to jump into questions from the audience. So 1 minute.
Oh, no, less than that. 10 seconds. Just adding. Yeah. Why are you guys limiting me?
By his books come out.
No. So really quickly, just to add on the conversation, we haven't even touched upon it, but to the issue of modifying language in that sense of pronouns, in Spanish right now, there is a movement on top of the Latinx to start using Latines, or replacing the los and las, the A and AS always with ES, which is even more confusing. So just to that point that Ahmad is saying that they couldn't do it in the language because it's confusing people. I've had a lot of very woke friends, I put it in between quotation mark, woke friends who write on Facebook with S, and it drives me crazy. It's hard to understand that. So if a person like myself, who have college education and have read, it can read in Spanish and read in English, are having a difficulty reading a basic paragraph with Latinx, Latina, Latinx. Imagine regular folks who this is completely alien to them.
Thank you. So I just want to read a couple of comments that we had come in on the chat, and then I want to get to a question that was actually in the Q&A as well. And out of respect for the people, they put this in the chat, but I won't name whoever. I'm just going to read the quote or the comment. One person says, these terms are labels. Labels are the greatest tools of a system of oppression or caste. It is so internalized that we label ourselves so as to be counted and add a value that is only recognized, yet it fuels divisiveness as labels are intended to do in an oppressive state. And then starred, recognized by the affinity group. Someone else says, I was a bit offended when I first heard this term because I was like, who gave us this name? And did I even have an option or a say? I felt forced. Since then, like the Afro-Latina Latinos we are, I personally took a negative and made it an opportunity to celebrate and show our resilience as a people. Another comment, I want to thank Rene for his eloquent elaboration of what I see as linguistic imperialism. The term is not grammatically or phonetically correct. Gracias, Ahmad, igualmente. And let's see if we have any more comments. Okay, so then we have a question. So this question is for everyone. And the question comes from Magda Calon. How do you feel that this is a benefit and or burden of the use of a term Latinx to identify those citizens that do not belong to white, black, native, or Asian? If so, what term would you propose to be used? So I'll read it again. How do you feel that this is a benefit and or burden of the use of a term Latinx to identify those citizens that do not belong to a white, black, native, or Asian groupings? If so, what term would you propose to be used? And Keith, I see that you'd like to answer it, so we'll definitely allow you to type that in. But to our panelists.
I don't see it as a benefit or a burden. I mean, I don't see any benefit in using the terminology, except for a very small group of people who might feel that the neutral language best explains the reality. Maybe they may, again, that's something I can't speak for them because I'm not a transgender person. Or in particular, that's another subject. There's also been women feminist groups who have argued that the Spanish language itself is very male oriented, that especially in plural, the use is male. You know, like for example, if there's one woman in the room, but there's three people there, and we want to talk about them being brothers, we don't say there's a brothers and sisters. We just say los hermanos, and includes her under a male label. So there are some women who have had that particular ideological debate or opposition to the use of the language. I don't see that in terms of what terms should we use. What I had said before, we already have the language to be able to use it. Usted, the plural, personas, ellos, ellas. I mean, it depends on who's using the label for themselves. If you're a transgendered person who do not feel yourself biologically male, even though you are, but you feel female, you can say, you know, the female de esto, yo, ellas. You know, if you were referring to other transgendered women who are friends, ellas son mis amigas, you can use that terminology the same way that somebody who's in disagreement to you can say, well, ellas tus amigas son ellos tus amigos. You know, the language itself is neutral in that sense. You can use any of the words any way you want. It all depends on what's the meaning behind it and what's the intention. Is it self-identifying? Is it someone in a position, etc.? But the language is there. It just depends on how you use the weapons, so to speak.
Anyone else who'd like to chime in? Wow, this is a
No.
Manuel.
I agree with Rene.
You agree with Rene?
Yeah.
I'm happy because this is a language specialist right here.
Well, so I want to say that, again, this has happened in academic circles, especially around the feminist movement, including Black feminist writing. There was like a push to do like woman, which is with a Y, and they also put an X at one point. And there's still work happening around the feminist work. So there is this, like, I think, larger, not just about gender identity per se, but patriarchal understanding of language, which I think is much older and much more dynamic and has things that we have to actually deal with, because that is a much more truer subject than whether gender identity is reflected in all kinds of language, but the natural patriarchal approach of the ways at which we use language, including in Spanish, but Spanish is not the only language. And what we informally call groups of people, hey guys, instead of like saying folks. Like there are ways in which even all kinds of languages do that. I will say, I think for other groups that aren't trying to work with Latinos or the Latinidad, I think what has worked for all the other communities, right? White communities also have ethnicity, right? And when we actually do organizing and policy work, you know, we can talk about new immigrants or folks that are Polish or these communities that shifted over time. And so I think the best thing for people to do is use the accuracy of language, that we need to stop finding shortcuts. I think that's gotten us into a lot of trouble, and that we actually start needing to think about what is the actual lived experience of these people, how do they self-identify, and what is the experiences that they're being shaped by the public policy and representation around them, right? Is the racial dynamic between Black Latinos and AAPI folks, right? Like, what does it look like to be Japanese and Hmong? Like, there are stratifications that are all in relationship to power and whiteness in a system that's been set up to not really function. And by lumping us together, we don't get to get into the minutia of what we actually need to change the lived experiences of everyday people. So my only real issue with Latinx, not that I really care that deeply about it, is I just think it somewhat erases our ability to be more articulate about the populations that we're talking about that just have different trajectories and lived experiences. And Latinx only allows us to say that it's some trans-inclusive term when that's just not accurate. And that's my issue, is like, we need to, in general, need to be better about naming who we're working with, what their problems are, how we experiencing that, and the policy solutions require that level of specificity to actually move us to a more liberatory space.
Karolyn, any
well, I was thinking about this earlier, and I actually would ask the same question. I'm like, if people have such an issue, I guess, with the term Latinx, then what other term would it be? Who has the right to, you know, come up with a term. We got people, you know, all over the place. They might accept it in, let's say, Central America, but let's say between like Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, they're like, no, we don't want that. So it's just like, how do we come to you know, an understanding or an agreement of what word we could use as gender inclusive, or are we just going to keep going with the traditional, which obviously the other 97% is doing. So I guess that's my take. If it's not Latinx, then what could it be? Who decides that, you know?
Well, so that's a great question, and that kind of brings us to the end of our discussion. And so I leave with one final statement and question. Mm-hmm. You know, any group of people throughout history who have thought about liberation, who have thought about progress for their people, any leader who has thought about that, or any collective group that has thought about that, part of the important work is the imagining of futures. It's the imagining, it's looking forward. And so I think that it's fitting that Karolyn, you come with this question, because as we look toward futures, and particularly let's look here in the context of North America, for people who identify as Latino or Hispanic in North America. What can all of you envision? And I would say just quick 30-second answer if you could. I know that's tough, but what is one way in which you can imagine in the future people identifying? How can we look toward the future in terms of identification? Because obviously, as I stated earlier, all throughout history, we've had this metamorphosis of language and identification, sometimes coming from the outside, sometimes self-identifying, but it's been said many times that he who controls the narrative controls the people, right? So how can we look at a future where Latinos as a unified group control narrative in terms of identification?
Let me begin. I am very concerned about the label, not for us, for the federal government. As you know, the academia and the scientific area is under attack. And basically, there is a popular movement to see academia as elitista or scientific as un montón de brutos. And the issue when we try to impose or offer from the academia, como dice Rene, or the elite group, that label, maybe we can get the contrary reaction to the base. Okay, aquí viene la academia con un nuevo label. I don't want it. I prefer to do myself as a Cuban, or Chicano, or Chicana, or Tejano. There's another group, or Puerto Rican, or New Yorican. And we have to be very careful about pushing any label right now, because the environment that there's a huge part of the population that see academic and the scientific agenda as elitista.
Thank you. Maybe time for, just a quick comment, Rene?
Yeah, just I want to quickly add on that. That's a dynamic that we didn't discuss there. The issue that, you know, if we impose where the gentleman who made the comment about linguistic imperialism and the issue of credibility, I keep coming down to the issue of consent and credibility. We have to be aware that both in the United States and in Latin America, there is an increase in right-wing populist movements, Christianized evangelical movements that can make a very quick identification of, you know, anything that smacks of feminism, of LGBT activism, is equally and already part of a larger structure of socialism, communism, chavismo, catrismo, in which it can label entire people, activists, academics, as dangerous people. We saw this in Cambodia with the educated folks being killed. We saw that in Nazi Germany. We're seeing in Bolsonaro's Brazil, where the practitioners of candomblé are being murdered because they represent, a different, Afro-Brazilian experience than the classes. So we are living in a very a time where we're seeing an increase in these type of movements, both in Latin America and Europe. So it's something to be thinking about, that the idea that we can impose this on people who are much more likely to be manipulated by power elites to say, you see, those academics, they're trying to make a level. We're testing, estamos jugando con fuego. And I'll leave it that en español, estamos jugando con fuego.
I agree.
Ahmad and Karolyn, 10 seconds apiece, if you could, 15 seconds.
I think for the future, I just hope, we naturally let the language evolve and hopefully come to an agreement, like I said before. And yeah.
Thank you. Ahmad.
I think Latino, Latina is the best that we have right now. And I think generally, the more specific that we can be to the cultural community that we're actually talking about, the better. So, proud Boricuas, Dominicans, Cubans, Chicanos, Argentinians, Chileans. Like, I want us to be able to tell people, be accurate with what we tell people and how we're navigating their relationship with them.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Karolyn Burgos, Ahmad Rivera Wagner, Manuel Frau-Ramos, Rene Gonzalez. Thank you to STCC, to Lydia Rivera Early, to Dr. John Cook, to Denise Hurst. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for attending. And I turn it back into the hands of Denise.
Thank you, Heshima, and thank you all for this amazing dialogue. For sure, I know that I have walked away with so much to think about, especially as someone who identifies as Boricua and Black. And it's just, it was really helpful to hear such a variety of perspectives. And Karolyn, I want to make sure that I also point out to really also, understand it from a generational perspective as well. So thank you all for your time. In closing, I just want to remind the viewing audience and even our panelists that if you have nothing to do on September 24th at noon, we invite you back for our second event commemorating and celebrating National Hispanic Heritage Month. We are going to have via Zoom, it's going to be Heritage Live with Jose Gonzalez y Banda Criolla. So in closing, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you to the attendees for tuning in.
Who is that Jose Gonzalez?
¿Quién es José González? No sé. Pregúntale a Lidia.
O a Rene.
Oh, ese es Rene. Oh, I'm sorry. Ellos pusieron José.
Oh, okay.
Un tratado Heshima Moja y ofrecimiento. No entiendo.
All right. Hasta luego. Adiós. Cuídense.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.